the small industrial town of Abertillery, South Wales. The year was 1906. It was a place defined by coal mines, soot-stained streets, and the rhythmic pulse of working-class life. Among the rows of terraced houses, a child named Harold Jones was born on January 11, 1906. He was the son of working-class parents. His father employed in the mines, his mother a homemaker. Like many families in South Wales during that era, theirs was a modest household shaped by long hours of labor and the constant pressure of survival in a town that revolved around coal. From the beginning, Harold appeared to be nothing unusual. Neighbors described him as polite, well-dressed, and clean. He was the kind of boy who blended into the background, neither troublesome nor particularly remarkable. Yet, within that quiet exterior, something darker was beginning to take root, a hidden nature that no one could have predicted. Growing up in Abertillery, Harold lived among children who spent their days playing in the streets, kicking balls fashioned out of rags, or venturing into the hills that overlooked the valleys. Life was simple, and children were expected to be obedient and respectful. Harold attended local school like other boys his age, and early reports suggested he was reasonably intelligent, though not academically gifted. He wasn't the kind of child who drew attention for brilliance or mischief. Instead, he lived in the shadows of others, unnoticed but always observing. The Jones family did not live in luxury. The First World War had left Britain struggling economically, and towns like Abertillery bore the brunt of those struggles. Families rationed what little they had, and children grew up quickly in an environment where work, hardship, and discipline were constants. For Harold, this meant a childhood where emotions were rarely expressed and expectations were rigid. In such an environment, a child's inner world could remain hidden from even the closest relatives. As Harold grew older, those who knew him began to notice qualities that stood out. He was quiet, sometimes too quiet. Unlike other boys who roughhoused in the streets, Harold often stood apart watching. There was a seriousness in his demeanor, a maturity beyond his years. To adults, this seemed admirable, almost comforting. A polite boy who didn't cause trouble was considered a blessing. Yet in hindsight, this composure masked something unsettling, a lack of genuine warmth and an absence of youthful innocence. By his early teenage years, Harold had developed a reputation for being trustworthy. He would run errands, deliver groceries, and perform tasks for shopkeepers and neighbors. People believed in his honesty and reliability, often entrusting him with responsibilities beyond his age. This trust would later prove fatal for those who placed too much confidence in his outward charm. At home, life was unremarkable. He was not abused, neglected, or raised in extreme poverty, conditions often associated with later criminal behavior. Instead, Harold's environment was stable enough, which made his later crimes all the more perplexing. There were no clear signs of trauma or desperation that could explain what was brewing within him. Psychologists who later studied his case argued that Harold Jones may have been what we now understand as a psychopath in childhood form. A boy born with traits of manipulation, lack of empathy, and an innate ability to mimic normalcy. The post-war era in which Harold came of age was one of contrasts. Britain was recovering, and while children were expected to be innocent, they were also exposed to the harsh realities of life far earlier than in modern times. Death, illness, and industrial accidents were common. Harold himself grew up hearing stories of tragedy in the mines, of families broken by loss. Yet he displayed no outward emotional response to such events. He seemed detached, unaffected, almost as though human suffering was nothing more than background noise. By 1920, Harold was 14 years old. he stood on the edge of adolescence, tall for his age and well-mannered. To those who met him, he came across as respectable, even admirable. Teachers spoke of his neatness and good behavior. Shopkeepers praised his helpfulness. Parents in the community encouraged their children to spend time with him, believing he was a safe influence. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, Harold was harboring desires and impulses he could not share. A fascination with control, with cruelty, and ultimately with death. It was around this time that small glimpses of his darker side occasionally surfaced. Some children later recalled that he could be manipulative, coaxing others into doing tasks for him or teasing them in subtle but cutting ways. Unlike the open bullying common among boys, Harold's approach was quieter, more calculated. He rarely raised his voice or lost his temper, but when he wanted something, he knew how to obtain it without suspicion. This ability to mask his true intentions would become central to his future crimes. In Abertillery, the community was tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone, and the trust between neighbors was almost unshakable. Children played freely in the streets without fear, running errands and visiting shops alone. This atmosphere of safety was what allowed Harold Jones to move unnoticed, to position himself as a harmless boy in a world that did not yet suspect that children could be killers. In the collective imagination of the time, murderers were hardened adults, strangers who lurked in shadows, not polite 15-year-old boys who attended Sunday school. By the time Harold turned 15 in early 1921, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. The people of Abertillery considered him a model young man, kind, respectable, and trustworthy. Yet within months, that perception would shatter. Behind the mask of innocence, Harold was preparing to commit acts that would shock his town to its core. Acts so incomprehensible that when the truth emerged, many refused to believe it at first. They could not reconcile the polite boy they knew with the horror of his deeds. Harold Jones's early life, then, is best understood as a portrait of normality hiding something abnormal. A boy who, on the surface, lived an ordinary working-class childhood, but who harbored within him the seeds of violence. The tragedy of his story begins here, in the streets of Abertillery, where trust, familiarity, and misplaced confidence would soon provide the perfect cover for murder. The year was 1921, and Abertillery, South Wales, was slowly finding its rhythm again after the hardships of World War I. The coal mining town, though poor and wary, carried a sense of unity. People trusted their neighbors, children ran errands without hesitation, and small corner shops were the heartbeat of daily life. It was in this environment, ordinary, familiar, and unsuspecting, that the town's darkest secret began to unfold. Among the residents was Freda Burnell, an 8-year-old girl. She was bright, cheerful, and well-liked in the community. Her family lived not far from Harold Jones's own home, and like many families in the area, they struggled but remained close-knit. Freda was the kind of child who trusted easily, a quality common among children in Abertillery, where danger was believed to lurk only far away, never in their own streets. By early 1921, Harold Jones was 15 years old. He had grown into a tall, well-presented teenager who worked as an errand boy for a local grocer named Mr. Little. Harold's reputation in town was nearly spotless. Customers praised his reliability, and families admired his politeness. He was the sort of boy parents pointed to as an example, clean, quiet, and seemingly responsible. But beneath this carefully constructed image, Harold was already carrying within him a darkness that no one had seen before. On February 5, 1921, Freda's family gave her a small task. She was asked to collect a parcel of groceries from the local shop where Harold worked. This was an ordinary errand, the kind that children ran every day. Freda left her home with the money and a smile, expecting nothing more than to return with food for her family. But she never came back. When Freda failed to return, her parents grew anxious. At first, they assumed she had been delayed or had stopped to play with friends. But as the hours stretched into the evening, panic began to spread. Neighbors joined the search, combing the streets, fields, and alleyways of Abertillery. Everyone knew Freda, and the thought of harm coming to her seemed unthinkable. Yet by nightfall, dread had settled over the town. The following day, the search ended in horror. Freda's body was discovered in a nearby culvert, hidden away as though someone had hoped she would never be found. The scene was grim. The little girl had been brutally attacked, her throat cut. The violence of the crime stunned the community. Abertillery, a town unaccustomed to such brutality, was thrown into collective shock. Parents clutched their children closer, and whispers spread through the streets who could have committed such an unspeakable act. Investigators quickly began piecing together Freda's last known movements. Witnesses reported seeing her at the grocer's shop on the day she disappeared. The boy who had served her was none other than Harold Jones. At first, suspicion did not fall heavily on him. After all, Harold was considered trustworthy, and many found it hard to believe that a polite 15-year-old could be involved in something so horrific. Still, the fact that he had been the last known person to see Freda alive could not be ignored. Harold was questioned by police, calm and composed. He explained that Freda had come to the shop, collected her parcel, and left. He claimed to have no knowledge of what happened afterward. His demeanor was striking. There was no nervousness, no stammering, no visible fear. For many, his steady composure was further proof of his innocence. Surely, they reasoned, if he were guilty, he would be anxious or defensive. Instead, Harold appeared cooperative and respectful, reinforcing the community's belief that he was incapable of murder. Despite the suspicions, police struggled to find evidence linking Harold to the crime. There were no witnesses who had seen him with Freda after she left the shop, no physical proof tying him to the scene. The forensic tools available in 1921 were primitive compared to today, and investigators had little more than testimony and circumstantial details. In the absence of solid evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. The funeral of Freda Burnell was a heart-wrenching affair. The town gathered in mourning, stunned that such a tragedy had befallen one of their own. Children cried quietly as they watched their friend laid to rest, while parents exchanged fearful glances, wondering if safety could ever again be taken for granted. In the midst of this grief, Harold Jones stood among the mourners. He even carried Freda's coffin during the funeral procession, a role that shocked many years later when the truth about him finally came to light. At the time, however, his presence was seen as a gesture of sympathy and respect, further removing suspicion from him. Behind closed doors, though, investigators could not shake the nagging feeling that Harold knew more than he let on. He had been the last person to see Freda alive. His account of her visit to the shop was straightforward, but lacked detail. And his calmness, though admired by the townsfolk, seemed unusual to detectives who expected more emotion from a boy who had been so close to the tragedy. Still, without evidence, the law could not hold him. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. The townspeople wanted answers, but none came. Fear lingered in the air, yet many clung to the belief that the killer must have been a stranger passing through. A drifter, perhaps, or an outsider who had left Abertillery behind. Few could imagine that the murderer walked among them, lived in their community and continued to smile politely at neighbors in the street. For Harold, life carried on as though nothing had happened. He continued to work at the grocer's, serving customers, running errands, and maintaining the image of a responsible young man. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Having committed his first murder, he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The act of killing had not filled him with remorse or guilt. Instead, it had given him a sense of power, a dark satisfaction that only emboldened him further. The murder of Freda Burnell was not merely an isolated tragedy. It was the opening act of Harold Jones's descent into infamy. The fact that he evaded capture after this crime gave him confidence. He had deceived his neighbors, fooled the police, and even stood at Freda's funeral without raising suspicion. In his mind, he may have believed himself untouchable. What no one knew at the time was that this misplaced trust and lack of evidence had set the stage for another, even more shocking crime, one that would force Abertillery to confront the truth about the boy they thought they knew. The murder of 8-year-old Freda Burnell had shaken Abertillery to its core. A town that once prided itself on trust and familiarity was now clouded with suspicion and grief. Parents no longer let their children roam the streets freely. Neighbors eyed one another with unease, and the community demanded justice. Someone had taken the life of an innocent child, and that someone had to be found. All trails of suspicion pointed to Harold Jones, the 15-year-old errand boy at the local grocer's shop. He had been the last known person to see Freda alive. He admitted she had come into the shop to collect her parcel, but beyond that, his story was vague. Detectives could not ignore the possibility that Harold was responsible, yet there was no direct evidence tying him to the crime. Nevertheless, under mounting public pressure, the police arrested Harold and charged him with Freda's murder. The decision stunned many in the town. For neighbors who had always seen Harold as polite, well-mannered, and trustworthy, the idea of him being a killer seemed impossible. Some were outraged at the very suggestion. Others, though, whispered quietly that perhaps the boy's calm composure was not as innocent as it appeared. The trial was set, and it quickly became one of the most sensational cases the region had ever seen. The courtroom filled with spectators each day, local townsfolk, journalists, and families desperate for answers. The sight of Harold Jones sitting in the dock was almost surreal. He was only 15 years old, tall for his age, but still undeniably a boy. His youth was emphasized by his schoolboy appearance, his neatly combed hair, and his calm demeanor. To many watching, it was difficult to reconcile this image with the brutality of the crime. From the beginning, Harold maintained his innocence. His defense was simple. Freda had come to the shop, collected her groceries, and left. He had no knowledge of what happened afterward. The prosecution, however, argued that Harold was lying. They highlighted inconsistencies in his account and pointed out that he was the last person to see Freda alive. But beyond these suspicions, their case lacked substance. The forensic methods available in 1921 were limited. There were no fingerprints linking Harold to the crime, no blood-stained clothing, no eyewitnesses who had seen him lead Freda away. The only thing connecting him to the case was circumstance. The jury was left to decide whether that was enough to condemn a 15-year-old boy to punishment for murder. As the trial unfolded, Harold's behavior fascinated both the public and the press. Unlike many defendants who showed signs of nerves or fear, Harold appeared unnervingly composed. He sat quietly, listening attentively, and when he spoke, he did so politely and clearly. He showed no outward signs of guilt, no emotion that might betray a troubled conscience. To some, this calmness suggested innocence. Surely no boy guilty of murder could remain so unshaken in the face of such accusations. To others, it hinted at something far more chilling, a coldness, a detachment, the ability to mask his true nature behind a facade of normalcy. The defense capitalized on Harold's youth. They painted him as a responsible boy, trusted by neighbors and shopkeepers, with no history of violence or misbehavior. They emphasized the lack of evidence and urged the jury not to convict on suspicion alone. In a town desperate for justice, this argument struck a chord. Could they really condemn a child without proof? The jury deliberated, and after careful consideration, the verdict was delivered. Harold Jones was acquitted of the murder of Freda Burnell. The courtroom erupted with mixed reactions. Some sighed with relief, convinced the boy had been wrongly accused. Others sat in stunned silence, certain that justice had slipped through their fingers. For Harold, the acquittal was a victory, but not just a legal one. It was a personal triumph, proof that he could outsmart the system, deceive the authorities, and walk free despite what he had done. His composure throughout the trial had convinced many of his innocence, and the lack of evidence had protected him. At only 15 years old, Harold Jones had learned a dangerous lesson: he could kill and get away with it. The aftermath of the trial left Abertillery divided. Some families embraced Harold once more, allowing their children to play with him, convinced he was a victim of unfair suspicion. Others remained uneasy, watching him with quiet distrust. But over time, the urgency of the case faded. The town mourned Freda and carried on with life. The idea that a child could be a killer seemed too far-fetched, too disturbing to believe. And so, Harold slipped back into the rhythms of everyday life, his secret still safe. What no one could have foreseen was that his acquittal did not end the nightmare. It only prolonged it. For Harold, the sense of power and freedom gained from escaping justice fed his dark impulses. He had silenced one child and deceived an entire community. Now, the temptation to kill again was irresistible. And it would not be long before another child's life was claimed. The trial of Harold Jones is remembered not only for its outcome, but also for what it revealed about human perception. People could not see past his youth, his politeness, his apparent innocence. They wanted to believe in the goodness of a child, even in the face of horror. In doing so, they overlooked the possibility that Harold was something far more dangerous than anyone dared to imagine. And so, the boy who had carried Freda Burnell's coffin at her funeral walked free, his crimes hidden by the mask of childhood. The justice system had failed, and Abertillery's trust in Harold Jones would soon prove fatal once again. For just 2 weeks after his acquittal, Harold would strike again, and this time, the town could no longer deny the truth. The acquittal of Harold Jones in the murder of Freda Burnell left the town of Abertillery divided, uneasy, and uncertain. Some believed justice had been served and the boy was innocent, while others carried a quiet suspicion that something was not right. But time has a way of dulling fear, and within just a few weeks, life in the coal mining town began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Children were once again sent out on errands, parents returned to their work, and Harold himself slipped seamlessly back into daily life. What no one realized was that Harold's acquittal had done something far more dangerous than clear his name. It had emboldened him. The 15-year-old had learned that he could deceive the police, outsmart the courts, and manipulate the trust of his community. He had killed once and escaped punishment. Now, free from suspicion and armed with newfound confidence, he was ready to kill again. On the morning of July 8, 1921, less than 2 weeks after his acquittal, Harold found his next victim. Her name was Florence Little, an 11-year-old girl who lived nearby. Florence came from a respectable family and was known in the community as friendly, cheerful, and obedient. She often ran errands for her parents, and on that day, she was asked to fetch items from the local shop, precisely the sort of opportunity Harold had been waiting for. By this time, Harold had returned to work at the grocer's. The townspeople, many of whom had felt guilty for doubting him, welcomed him back into their trust. Once again, he was the polite shop boy, carrying parcels and delivering groceries. But beneath this facade, Harold's mind was dark and restless. He had tasted the thrill of murder and the intoxicating power of escaping justice. Now, he sought that feeling again. Florence walked into the shop that morning with her usual smile. Harold greeted her politely, as he did with every customer. But instead of simply serving her and sending her on her way, he convinced her to follow him to his nearby home. What he told her, we may never know. Perhaps he promised to fetch something special, or perhaps his calm, older boy authority was enough to make her trust him. In a town where Harold had been publicly declared innocent, Florence likely saw no danger in his company. Once inside his house, Harold revealed his true self. What happened next was an act of chilling brutality. Florence was murdered with shocking violence. She had been strangled and beaten before her body was hidden away in the attic of Harold's family home. For hours, the girl lay lifeless just above where Harold's unsuspecting parents went about their day, oblivious to the horror their son had carried out under their roof. When Florence failed to return home, her parents quickly grew worried. The memory of Freda Burnell's murder was still fresh in the minds of the townspeople, and the thought of another child disappearing struck terror into the community. A search began almost immediately. Families scoured the streets. Neighbors knocked on doors, and once again, all eyes turned to the last place Florence had been seen, the grocer's shop. When questioned, Harold claimed to know nothing. Calm and collected as ever, he told searchers that Florence had left the shop as usual. His composure was unnerving. Even as neighbors frantically searched for the missing girl, Harold assisted them, pretending to share their concern. At one point, he even joined the search party that walked the very streets where Florence's parents called out her name. But this time, Harold's mask of innocence began to slip. Suspicion fell on him once more, not because of evidence at first, but because of proximity. He had been the last to see Freda alive, and now he was the last to see Florence. The coincidence was too much for many to ignore. Soon, whispers spread, could Harold Jones truly be innocent, or had the town been deceived all along? The search grew more desperate as hours passed. Then came the grim discovery that shattered the community. Florence's body was found hidden inside Harold's home, tucked away in the attic. The shock was indescribable. Parents who had once defended Harold gasped in horror. Neighbors who had trusted him stood in disbelief. And for those who had always suspected, the truth was both devastating and enraging. The boy they had welcomed back after his acquittal had, in fact, been guilty all along, and now another child was dead because of it. The police wasted no time. Harold Jones was arrested on the spot. Unlike his first arrest, this time there was no room for doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. Florence had been last seen with Harold, and her body had been found in his home. There would be no acquittal, no escape, no sympathy. The town that had once defended him now turned against him with fury. As Harold was led away by officers, his demeanor remained chillingly calm. He did not weep, he did not protest, and he did not appear afraid. Even at 15, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Yet he displayed none of the fear or remorse one might expect. To onlookers, this cold detachment was more disturbing than anything else. The murder of Florence little destroyed what little innocence Abertillery had left. The community, once so trusting, was forced to confront the reality that evil could live among them in the most unexpected form. A boy, polite and well-spoken, who carried groceries for their families. Parents who had once insisted Harold was incapable of such acts now grappled with unbearable guilt. Had they defended a killer? Had their misplaced trust cost Florence her life? For Harold, the second murder was not an act of desperation, but of compulsion. He had learned from Freda's case that the thrill of killing could be hidden behind a mask of normalcy. Florence's murder was proof that he was willing to risk everything for the satisfaction of his dark impulses. But unlike before, there would be no escape. His crimes had finally caught up with him, and now even the law could no longer look past the evidence. The boy who had once carried Freda's coffin was now known for what he truly was, a murderer. Abertillery had given him a second chance, and he had used it to kill again. And as Harold sat in his cell awaiting trial, the community that once trusted him was left to mourn not only the lives of two innocent children, but also the shattering of their belief in safety. Innocence and trust itself. The murder of Florence little marked a turning point in the life of Harold Jones and the town of Abertillery. Unlike the case of Freda Burnell, where suspicion hovered but proof was absent, the evidence against Harold this time was undeniable. The discovery of Florence's body in his own home was not merely a clue. It was a damning testament to his guilt. The boy who had once deceived an entire town now faced the full weight of the law, and there would be no acquittal to save him. On the morning of his arrest, Harold was taken quietly from his home. His composure, so unsettling during his earlier trial, remained intact. He did not resist, he did not cry, and he did not protest. To the police and the townspeople who watched, there was something chilling about his calmness. He walked with a deliberate, almost practiced ease, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind. The town that had once admired his manners now saw in them a mask that concealed unimaginable darkness. The investigation moved swiftly. Detectives documented every detail of the scene where Florence had been murdered. Her small body, hidden in the attic, bore the marks of a violent struggle. Her throat had been cut, her limbs bruised, and her eyes, once filled with life, now stared blankly at a ceiling that had witnessed horror. Evidence left little doubt about the identity of the killer. The connection to Harold Jones was undeniable. He had lured her, killed her, and attempted to hide the crime. The time for deception had ended. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in South Wales at the time. Newspapers across the region reported daily on the proceedings, capturing every grim detail. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to witness the fate of the boy who had terrified Abertillery. Inside, the courtroom was tense, with parents, neighbors, and curious onlookers pressing against the benches. Harold Jones, once the polite boy admired by the town, now sat in the dock as an accused murderer. From the outset, the case against Harold was overwhelming. Witnesses recounted seeing Florence leave her home, walk toward the shop, and enter Harold's company. There were no contradictions or alibis that could protect him. Most damning of all was the location of the body. It was hidden in Harold's home, under his roof, in the very place his family lived. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Harold had killed once and, emboldened by his previous acquittal, killed again. This was not an accident, they argued, nor the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. This was premeditated murder by a calculating mind. Throughout the trial, Harold maintained a disturbing calm. When questioned, he responded politely, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. There was no sign of remorse, no trace of panic. His ability to mask his emotions captivated the courtroom. Psychologists later analyzing the case would note that his demeanor exhibited traits of what we now recognize as psychopathy. Charm, manipulation, and a profound lack of empathy. At just 15, Harold Jones displayed a level of cold-bloodedness rarely seen even among adults accused of violent crimes. The defense, in contrast, was limited. Unlike the Freda Burnell case, there was little room to argue innocence. The facts were too clear, the evidence too strong. Attempts to portray Harold as a misguided youth or to downplay his responsibility were met with skepticism. The judge, aware of the gravity of the situation, emphasized the need for justice for the victims. The jury had little choice but to weigh the evidence against the boy before them, a child yet undeniably a killer. During the proceedings, the town's emotions were raw. Many felt betrayed by the boy they had once admired. Parents whispered in horror as they recounted Harold's earlier reputation for reliability and politeness. How could a child so seemingly ordinary harbor the capacity for such violence? The trial became not just a legal battle, but a community reckoning with the nature of evil and the illusion of innocence. As testimony continued, details of Harold's methods emerged. He had lured Florence into his home with apparent ease, exploiting the trust built by his prior acquittal. The prosecution argued that this was evidence of cunning and intent. He had learned from his first crime, they said, and had used his knowledge to attempt another. Unlike many young offenders who act impulsively, Harold's actions displayed planning, calculation, and a disturbing confidence that he could manipulate others. After days of evidence, witness testimony, and intense deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Unlike the first trial, there could be no doubt. Harold Jones was found guilty of the murder of Florence Little. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For the parents of Florence, for the town of Abertillery, and for a community haunted by fear, the verdict was a measure of closure, though a bitter one. The sentence was severe but reflective of the era. Harold, though still a minor, would face imprisonment for his crimes. The judge acknowledged his age, but emphasized that the brutality of his actions demanded accountability. 15 years old and already twice a murderer, Harold Jones's life would now be defined by confinement, reflection, and a world he had brought upon himself. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the town. Abertillery, once a community of trust, had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of misplaced confidence in appearances. Parents became cautious, children were watched more closely, and the collective innocence of the town was forever lost. Harold Jones, the boy who had carried one child's coffin and deceived the community, was now a symbol of hidden evil, a reminder that appearances could be dangerously deceptive. Even in prison, Harold's calm demeanor persisted. Reports from authorities would later describe him as quiet, polite, and seemingly untroubled by the weight of his crimes. He had learned that charm and composure could shield him from suspicion, and those traits would continue to define him as he navigated the years ahead behind bars. The trial of Harold Jones served as a chilling lesson about the complexities of human nature. How could a child, entrusted and admired by a community, commit acts of unimaginable violence? How could innocence and evil coexist in a single person so young? For historians and psychologists studying the case today, Harold Jones represents a rare but terrifying example of juvenile psychopathy. A young killer who manipulated the world around him while hiding a darkness that would take decades to fully understand. Following his conviction for the murder of Florence Little, 15-year-old Harold Jones was sent to a youth detention facility, marking the beginning of a period that would define his life behind bars. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Harold did not respond to confinement with rebellion or despair. From the very first day, he maintained an air of composure and control that was as unnerving to prison staff as it had been to the townspeople of Abertillery. Harold was initially placed in Winson Green Prison, a facility in Birmingham, England, which housed young offenders as well as adults. The conditions were harsh by modern standards. Cold cells, strict routines, and rigorous discipline formed the backbone of the penal system at the time. Yet Harold adapted quickly. He observed carefully, learned the routines of guards and fellow inmates, and positioned himself as a model prisoner. This behavior, however, was not the product of remorse or rehabilitation. Rather, it was a calculated effort to maintain control over his environment, a reflection of the manipulative tendencies that had characterized his crimes. Prison officers noted that Harold was unusually polite and attentive. He followed instructions without complaint, performed assigned duties meticulously, and rarely caused disturbances. Unlike other young offenders, he did not seek attention or validation. Instead, he seemed almost invisible, blending into the institutional routine while quietly asserting dominance through his calm intelligence. Psychologists who later reviewed his case suggested that these behaviors were indicative of early psychopathic traits: charm, manipulation, and a remarkable capacity to mask inner violence. During his time in detention, Harold received formal education as part of the youth rehabilitation program. While he was not academically exceptional, he absorbed lessons quickly and demonstrated a capacity for learning that allowed him to engage with both peers and instructors effectively. He read widely, though records suggest he often chose material that reflected darker themes, hinting at a continued fascination with death and human vulnerability. Teachers reported him as polite and cooperative, yet there was always a sense of emotional detachment, an inability to connect with his own feelings or those of others. Interactions with fellow inmates were also telling. Harold was not prone to violent outbursts, yet he exhibited a subtle form of dominance. He could manipulate others, subtly intimidating or controlling without resorting to physical aggression. Younger prisoners gravitated toward him, seeing him as capable and clever, while older or more aggressive inmates learned to avoid confrontation with him. Even at a young age, Harold had developed a method of asserting power quietly, without drawing attention to himself, a skill that would continue to define his life long after release. Prison authorities noted his good behavior, but there were moments that hinted at the darkness still residing within him. Reports suggested that he occasionally engaged in morbid discussions with other inmates, expressing fascination with death and crime. He seemed to study human reactions, testing boundaries and observing fear in subtle ways. Though never overtly violent in prison, his curiosity about the macabre suggested that his earlier crimes had not extinguished his impulses, only delayed them. As Harold grew older, his sentence continued to reflect both the seriousness of his crimes and his youth at the time of commission. While many young offenders would spend only a few years in detention, Harold's case was treated with a mix of caution and pragmatism. Authorities understood that a mind like his required supervision, but also recognized that his age at the time of the murders could influence parole decisions later. Over the years, Harold's behavior remained exemplary, earning him incremental privileges and increasing trust from prison staff. By the mid-1930s, Harold was no longer a teenager. He had spent over a decade behind bars, yet he remained composed, methodical, and in complete control of his interactions with others. Guards who had observed him over the years noted a remarkable consistency. Harold never displayed overt remorse, never admitted guilt beyond legal requirements, and never formed genuine emotional connections. Instead, he continued to project an image of civility, masking the dangerous impulses that had defined his youth. In 1941, after approximately 20 years in confinement and a combination of good behavior and administrative decisions, Harold Jones was released from prison. At 35 years old, he stepped into the world as a free man, a man who had once committed 2 murders as a teenager, but had been quietly reintegrated into society. The world he returned to was different from the one he had left. Britain was embroiled in the Second World War, and cities were being reshaped by air raids, rationing, and the demands of war. The chaos of the era provided Harold with anonymity, allowing him to live undisturbed and unnoticed. Upon release, Harold sought to create a life that would avoid scrutiny. He moved to London, changed his surroundings, and adopted a low-profile existence. Records suggest he found work, married, and attempted to integrate into ordinary society. To the outside world, he appeared as a hardworking, quiet individual, someone who had served time for youthful mistakes and was now living responsibly. Yet behind this ordinary facade, the traits that had driven him to murder remained dormant but intact. Calm intelligence, manipulative charm, and the capacity to conceal his true nature. Harold Jones's prison years offer a chilling insight into the mind of a young killer transformed by confinement. While he had served his sentence, he had not been rehabilitated in the emotional or psychological sense. He had learned to navigate institutions, to control perception, and to live among others while hiding his true self. By the time of his release, he had perfected the art of concealment of organized serial killers, individuals who can compartmentalize their violent impulses and operate undetected for extended periods. While the theory linking Harold to the Jack the Stripper murders remains speculative, it is grounded in patterns of behavior and opportunity. Investigators considered factors such as proximity, timing, and psychological profile. Harold was known to have lived in London during the period of the murders and had demonstrated lethal capability decades earlier. These facts alone did not prove guilt, but they made him a person of interest in historical reviews of the case. Despite these connections, significant challenges prevented any definitive conclusions. Harold had already passed away by 1971, leaving investigators with no opportunity to interrogate him, examine his habits in detail, or conduct forensic testing. DNA analysis, which could have provided conclusive evidence, was unavailable at the time of both his death and the murders in the 1960s. Furthermore, the difference in victim age and context, the transition from children to adult women, introduced additional uncertainty. Analysts could draw behavioral parallels, but could not confirm the link. Public fascination with the theory grew in the 2000s as true crime enthusiasts and journalists explored the possible connections. Documentaries and investigative reports highlighted Harold's early crimes, his ability to evade suspicion, and the eerie overlap of location and timeline with the Jack the Stripper case. Some argued that his presence in London during the murders, combined with his history of violent behavior, made him a credible candidate. Others cautioned against drawing conclusions, emphasizing the lack of physical evidence and the danger of retroactive profiling. Forensic psychologists examining Harold's history noted that his earlier crimes revealed patterns that could extend into adulthood. His capacity for manipulation, emotional detachment, and controlled violence suggested that he could have committed further murders without detection. The possibility that he had adapted his methods to avoid capture, targeting different victims in a densely populated city, could explain why he was never linked definitively to subsequent crimes. These observations, while speculative, remain part of the broader discussion of Harold's life and potential reach as a criminal. Ultimately, the link between Harold Jones and the Jack the Stripper murders remains unresolved. No conclusive evidence has ever been found to confirm his involvement, and investigators caution against treating the theory as fact. Yet the mere possibility underscores the chilling implications of Harold's capacity for violence. It highlights a man who, in his youth, had killed without remorse, learned to evade detection, and then spent decades blending seamlessly into society. The idea that such an individual could have continued offending in secret adds a haunting dimension to his story. The discussion also serves as a reminder of the challenges inherent in historical criminal investigations. Cases like Harold Jones's reveal the limits of early forensic methods, the difficulties of profiling, and the ways in which time can obscure truth. Even today, researchers continue to revisit old files, interview witnesses, and analyze historical data in the hope of uncovering patterns that were once hidden. Harold's name, once confined to local Welsh history, now appears in broader debates about unsolved crimes and the elusive nature of serial offenders. In examining the possible connection to the Jack the Stripper murders, Harold Jones's legacy is more than the sum of his confirmed crimes. It represents a life of concealed danger, the terrifying potential for hidden violence, and the long shadow that one individual's actions can cast across decades. While we may never know the full truth, the speculation itself illuminates the unsettling reality of Harold's psychology, a man capable of immense violence, capable of manipulating perception, and capable of living undetected among the unsuspecting masses. The story of Harold Jones, the Welsh child killer, does not end with his death in 1971. Rather, it extends into the realms of history, criminology, and psychology, offering chilling lessons about human behavior, societal perception, and the nature of concealed evil. From his first murder at the age of 15 to the decades of quiet life that followed, Harold's life presents a rare, unsettling study of juvenile psychopathy and the long-term consequences of early violent behavior. Harold's crimes, the murders of Freda Burnell and Florence Little, were not merely acts of violence. They were deliberate, calculated, and indicative of a mind capable of manipulation. Both victims were children, innocent and trusting, drawn into Harold's orbit by circumstance and charm. In each case, he exploited the trust of adults and the vulnerability of his victims, committing acts that were as cold as they were brutal. The calculated nature of these murders suggested a psychological profile that was advanced beyond his years. A dangerous combination of intelligence, cunning, and a lack of empathy. Following his acquittal for Freda's murder, Harold's immediate return to criminal behavior underscores a critical feature of his psychological makeup: the compulsion to kill, coupled with the ability to evade accountability. Whereas many adolescents who commit violent acts are impulsive or emotionally reactive, Harold demonstrated premeditation and strategic thinking. His second murder of Florence Little occurred shortly after his acquittal, revealing both confidence in his own deceit and an alarming persistence of homicidal tendencies. This early manifestation of psychopathy is a topic of intense study in criminology and psychology, as cases like Harold's are rare but provide profound insights into the development of violent behavior. Harold's subsequent life, spanning 3 decades in London, adds another layer of complexity. For 30 years he lived among ordinary people, appearing as a polite, quiet, and responsible man. He married, maintained steady employment, and remained undetected. This ability to blend into society illustrates one of the most dangerous aspects of psychopathy, the capacity for charm, normalcy, and social manipulation. Outwardly, Harold conformed. Inwardly, he concealed a dark and violent history. Psychologists studying similar cases emphasize that such individuals are often highly skilled at compartmentalization, suppressing urges or channeling them in ways that allow them to navigate society without detection. Harold exemplified this duality, maintaining a socially acceptable facade while the memory of his early crimes lingered in the shadows. In retrospect, Harold Jones is a case study in juvenile psychopathy and the trajectory of a violent individual. Modern forensic psychology highlights several key traits that he exhibited: superficial charm, emotional detachment, calculated aggression, manipulative intelligence, and the absence of remorse. These characteristics, observable even in his teenage years, suggest that Harold's behavioral patterns were deeply ingrained rather than the product of circumstance alone. The implication is chilling. A person can possess the outward appearance of normalcy while harboring violent tendencies that, if unchecked, may persist indefinitely. The posthumous exposure of Harold's life in the early 2000s sparked renewed interest in his story, prompting historians and true crime analysts to reassess the impact of his crimes and his later anonymity. It revealed a gap in societal awareness. Even after committing heinous acts, individuals can integrate into communities undetected if they possess the right combination of intelligence, social skills, and restraint. Harold's life challenges assumptions about rehabilitation, punishment, and the visibility of dangerous individuals, highlighting the need for vigilance, careful assessment, and the limitations of trusting appearances alone. The potential link to the Jack the Stripper murders, while speculative, underscores the enduring fascination with Harold's capabilities. Though there is no direct evidence connecting him to these unsolved crimes, the psychological and situational parallels are striking. Harold's presence in London during the 1960s, combined with his proven capacity for violence, manipulation, and evasion, invites speculation about whether he could have committed additional murders undetected. Such discussions, even hypothetical, illuminate broader questions about criminal behavior, the persistence of psychopathic traits, and society's ability to recognize hidden threats. Harold's legacy is multifaceted. On one level, he is remembered as a child killer, a young man who brutally murdered 2 children and deceived his community. On another level, he represents a psychological phenomenon, the capacity for violence, deception, and normalcy to coexist in a single individual. His life serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that appearances can be dangerously misleading and that extraordinary vigilance is required when assessing risk, even in seemingly ordinary individuals. Criminologists continue to examine Harold Jones to understand how early intervention might have altered his trajectory. Could greater supervision, psychological assessment, or intervention following the first murder have prevented the second? Modern research into juvenile offenders suggests that early identification of psychopathic traits, combined with structured therapeutic programs, can reduce the likelihood of recidivism. Harold's case, however, highlights the historical limitations of such approaches. In 1921, Psychological understanding of juvenile psychopathy was rudimentary, and the justice system was ill-equipped to respond effectively to his unique profile. Moreover, Harold's life after prison raises questions about societal reintegration. While he did not commit further known murders after his release, his ability to live undetected among ordinary people demonstrates that concealment, rather than rehabilitation, defined his post-prison existence. His quiet life may be seen as both a relief that no further children were harmed and a testament to his enduring capacity for self-control and manipulation. It is a reminder that the absence of observable crime does not necessarily equate to moral or psychological transformation. In summary, Harold Jones remains one of the most compelling and disturbing figures in criminal history. From his teenage murders in South Wales to his decades-long anonymity in London, he exemplifies the complex interplay between innate psychopathy, opportunity, and societal perception. His story challenges our understanding of criminal behavior, the potential for rehabilitation, and the hidden dangers that can exist behind ordinary appearances. Today, Harold's legacy is preserved not in infamy or fame, but in the study of human behavior, criminal psychology, and the history of juvenile crime. His life, crimes, and posthumous revelations continue to educate, horrify, and fascinate those who seek to understand the darkest corners of human nature. In the end, Harold Jones serves as a chilling reminder that evil can reside in the most unlikely of places. A polite, quiet face in the crowd, and that history sometimes uncovers truths far more unsettling than anyone could imagine.